Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to another live session. Today's topic is really important. It is about ethics and ethics in relation to artificial intelligence and things like big data. So, in this session, we will explore how important ethics are. Do they really matter? And we will look at some of the biggest ethical dilemmas when it comes to AI. And to do this, I'm joined today by Reid Blackman, who has just written a Harvard Business Review article called "A Practical Guide to Business to Building Ethical AI," which really caught my attention. And then I reached out and I invited Reid to come on. You're also the founder and CEO of Virtue, and you are a member of the AI Advisory Board at EY. So welcome, Reid.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so welcome. So maybe we can explore who Reid Blackman is in a bit more detail. So you in the past you were a philosophy professor. You also early on started a fireworks wholesaling company.
Yeah.
You were even a flying trapeze instructor.
Yeah.
Today you're a consultant that helps businesses with data and AI ethics. So maybe you can share with us your journey and how you ended up where you are today, what motivated you to go into this field, and how you help companies today.
Yeah, sure. I should say that, when the night that I met my wife to be, I played the game with her, Two Truths and a Lie. You know that game?
Yes.
And so I told her I'm a professor of philosophy. I own a fireworks wholesaling company, and I'm a flying trapeze instructor. And she had no idea what to say. I cheated at the game, but I wasn't trying to win the game. Obviously, I was trying to get her phone number, and it worked. Anyway, so yeah, I was a professor of philosophy for a decade, and obviously I was studying in graduate school and undergrad before that. Teaching, researching, publishing, mostly on ethics. I did my sort of philosophical side hustle was Nietzsche scholarship. Very popular that. Yeah, so I did that for about 10 years. Loved it. Loved philosophy. Still love philosophy. Wasn't totally in love with academia. And the fireworks company stuff is actually relevant to my ethics consultancy, because when I was a professor, I got involved with the entrepreneurship organization at the university. When the founder of that entrepreneurship organization learned that not only was I a faculty member, but I had this wholesaling business, he said, "Oh, would you be interested in being a mentor to the startups that we mentor?" And so I thought, of course, yeah, that sounds really fun. And so I started, being one of the mentors, helping students going from nothing to something at any rate, whether it was a nonprofit or a for-profit startup. And I found myself jealous is a bit strong, but sort of, ooh, it would be really fun for me to start a new business. And what would that look like? What would I want to do? And I thought, well, I have got this expertise in ethics, but what does that even look like? Well, what's the business? So it's probably going to be a consultancy of some kind. And then the question was, well, what's the market for that, right? Like, who am I selling ethics to? And at the time, and this was probably, I don't know, maybe it's like 7 years ago now, something like that I first had the thought. I didn't do anything about it except sort of mildly poke around, because I didn't think that there was a market. And then you fast forward, a few years, and Cambridge Analytica scandal happens. And so you have delete Facebook going viral, and then the Me Too movement, and then Black Lives Matter, at least in the States. And then you have the engineers ringing the alarm bells around the societal impacts of AI. And at that point, I thought, okay, there's actually a market now. It's reputational risk. Ethics is reputational risk at this point, because if you screw up ethically, then you'll go viral. You can go viral for the wrong reasons. You can invite lawsuits and investigations. You just do damage to your brand, right? So I thought, I can sell risk mitigation, because if people don't get their ethical houses in order, then they're going to be in trouble. But they don't know how to get their ethical houses in order, because ethics for a lot of people is just sort of this unwieldy thing to deal with. But of course, I know how to deal with it. And so off I went.
Very good. As always, these sessions are hopefully engaging. We want people to say hello. We want people to ask questions and take part in this discussion. So anyone listening, if you have specific questions around ethics when it comes to AI and data and technology, if you have any specific comments, any shout outs, just let us know. I'm just having a little look through the stream, and I think every single one we've done so far has covered every continent other than Antarctica. So if anyone from Antarctica is watching, shout out. So we're saying, just having like Eric is saying hello. I've got Nahed from Kuwait. I've got Mudud from Bangladesh joining in. We've got Veronica from Spain. Really good to see you. We've got Rohit from India. We've got someone from Brazil joining us. We've got Jenny from Sweden. Hussein from Egypt. We've got Sharif from Indonesia. So really good to see everyone on this screen. On the stream. Philippines, the US. Good morning, everyone from Indianapolis. Really good to join us, Amy. So, as I said, if you have any questions, any comments, just let us know. So today is an important day. For the US in particular, for the world potentially. We have the US election votes being counted, and sometimes you wonder how important ethics really are, because if you think about the amount of fake news that is out there, I feel that some of the tech companies are still reluctant to actually take an ethical stance. We've seen this today with Twitter actually highlighting that some of the, or at least one of the tweets that the president tweeted earlier was misleading potentially. So they put a note on it and stop people from liking and sharing it. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Why is ethics important? Does it really matter in today's political and business environment? And if so, why?
No. Next question. Yeah, of course it matters. I mean, of course it does. So look, at a societal level, I think we all know why ethics matters, right? Doing the right thing, or at least abstaining from doing the wrong thing, is important for its own sake. Harming people is unethical. It's bad. Shouldn't do it. So on and so forth. Another issue that's crucial for society to function well and for a business to function well is trust, right? If you don't trust people, then it's hard to work with them. It's very difficult to collaborate. And it's very difficult to collaborate, then it's both difficult to be citizens together in the same country, and it's difficult to be colleagues in the same company. And ethics, if people are acting ethically and you can trust your fellow citizen or colleague to act ethically, that means that they are doing things like showing respect for you and other people. They are taking your welfare into consideration. And that's the kind of thing that breeds trust. And I mean, we all know, if a culture, whether it's a city, state, a country, or if it's a business, if it's riddled with distrust, it's a hard environment to thrive in.
Very good. So anyone listening, just put into the comments what you see as some of the biggest ethical dilemmas when it comes to AI, when it comes to big data, when it comes to modern technology. So let us know your thoughts. And while you're doing this, I want to ask Reid, I want to ask you the same question. What do you see as some of the biggest ethical dilemmas when it comes to artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer your question. I actually just saw a really interesting question from Dan Gustafson, who said, so ethics as trust means predictability in human relations, ? And I think that's part of it. And some of what I said indicated that it's a bit about predictability, but it's not just predictability, right? Because I can predict that you're going to treat me really poorly. That doesn't thereby mean that you're treating me ethically, right? So prediction is not sufficient for ethical treatment. When I talk about trust, so you might distinguish between two kinds of trust. There's, I trust that you will do such and such, I trust that, for instance, you will treat me poorly, or I trust that you will go to the baseball game on time, or I trust that you will vote, et cetera, et cetera. But if I trust you, something along those lines, then that means something like, I believe that you will do right by me. I believe that you will take my welfare or my happiness, my well-being into consideration when you're deliberating about what to do. Right? So it's not just, I mean, you could say it's a certain subset of all predictions. It's a prediction that you will take my welfare seriously when considering what you ought to do. So that's the kind of trust that I'm talking about. That's the kind of thing that ethics concerns itself with, or at least it's one of the core things with which ethics concerns itself. To put it slightly differently, it concerns itself with, at least in part, the trustworthy. So it's not merely what causes trust. A con man can cause you to trust him, but that doesn't mean that he's trustworthy. So what we care about when we're talking about ethics is people being trustworthy, creating companies that are trustworthy, and so on. And
to make it even more real for people, then, do you have any examples of companies that have failed, maybe from an ethical point of view, and have not managed to build this trust? And have you got any examples of companies where you feel actually they're getting there, they're starting to build this trust, and they're building the kind of ethical environment that works and everyone trusts them?
Yeah, I mean, so look, the example that everybody knows is Facebook, right? From the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So do we trust that Facebook takes proper care of our data in their, say, storage of it and with whom they share it? But it's not just that. So, there was the recent Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, where there is the charge that Facebook operates in a way that is bad for the mental health of its users. Which is just to say it's not treating them in an ethical way, because it's not acting in a way that where they take the welfare of its users seriously. Rather, it takes the welfare of its shareholders seriously, or the people who are serving up ads, the people that they're selling ad space to. So that's a prime example of a company that has lost the trust of people, in part, one, from who they share it with, but also how they're treating their users on a daily basis. Now, you also asked who's doing something about, an example of a company that's starting to do something about this. And I think that it's still TBD, but Facebook has, I believe just this past summer, started a responsible innovation department. And now they have a number of people working within Facebook who are working to build responsible innovation, ethics into product development. Now, it's a massive company, right? And it's not clear whether, whatever efforts they have will be able to scale, or they'll be sufficiently effective. It's to be determined, but they're clearly making an effort. And for what it's worth, I know some of the people who are there, and they're quite sincere in wanting to inject ethics into product development.
Yeah, we hope that this will actually happen. That would be a good starting point. Just having a look, Hemant is asking an interesting question here. What's the difference between ethics and law? Yeah.
Great question. So rather than give a sort of formal definition of each one, I can just give you some examples where things are ethical but not illegal, or illegal but not unethical. Right? So you can lie to your friend. It's not illegal, right? You can, at least in the US, you can cheat on your spouse, and that's not illegal, but it is unethical. You can, break a promise to your child. You promise that you would take them to the movies. You don't do it after all. You broke a promise. That's arguably, depending on circumstances, ethically wrong, certainly not illegal. And then on the other hand, we've got some cases where things are legal but not unethical. So you might think that if you're driving 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, that's illegal. It's not unethical. Assuming that driving 5 miles per hour over the speed limit doesn't increase in any significant way the potential harm, right? Going through a red light when there's at a 4-way intersection, when there's literally, 3 a.m, no one is around, you can see, all the other, you can see down the roads, there's no trees blocking, and you go through the red light, that's illegal, but it's not unethical. Filing taxes too late or something like that might be illegal, but not unethical. And so there's lots of examples. Now, so I don't know if that's sufficient, but I'm trying to give a flavor for things that could be unethical but not illegal, and things that can be illegal but not unethical.
Yeah, which is my feeling that lots of tech companies basically protect themselves behind a legal safety net, saying, okay, this is all within the law what we're doing, but actually you would say this is not ethical. How do we bridge this gap?
Yeah, so I mean, like there's a number of questions you can ask yourself when you're asking whether or not you're treating people ethically. And to put it slightly differently, in the language that we were talking about earlier, whether you're acting in a way that makes you and your company trustworthy, worthy of being trusted, meriting trust. So you can ask about what kinds of obligations do we have to people that might not be captured by the law. For instance, we might have obligations not to manipulate people's emotions. For instance, there's no law, right? But if you're manipulating people's emotions in a way that's not conducive to their welfare, that looks, on the face of it anyway, like it's unethical. And if you think there's an obligation, not to do that, then you ought not to do it, all else equal. You're absolutely right that a lot of companies confuse something like legal compliance with being trustworthy, but in truth, the regulations have not yet caught up to the technology, right? So there's lots of things that we can do with massive troves of data, with machine learning, VR, AR, and so on, and the law just doesn't say very much about these kinds of things. In fact, there are some cases in which the law does say something, but it doesn't quite say the right thing. So I don't know how much detail we want to get here, but discrimination is illegal, right? We already have anti-discrimination laws in the U.S. There's disparate treatment and disparate impact. In the UK, you have direct discrimination versus indirect discrimination. Those things are both on the books as being illegal, but there's ways in which those laws don't quite capture what's going on in the case of discrimination with biased algorithms. So for instance, direct, and I'll speak in the language of the UK, direct discrimination requires some kind of motive to discriminate, but you're not going to get that in the case of a biased algorithm, because standardly no engineer is intending to introduce bias into their algorithm. They're just doing it accidentally for, there's a variety of reasons.
Very good. So John is just saying, interesting topic. Thank you very much, Jens. That's always good to hear. Rajesh is asking, who basically decides what is ethical? Because it could be a cultural difference. Yeah. So I guess, especially you were talking about AI and big data. If you look at what some of the Chinese companies are doing, this is very different to what some of the US companies would be doing, or even companies in Europe.
Yeah.
So how do we decide what ethics to follow, and how do we involve executives in this discussion, and how do we come up with an ethical path that everyone buys into?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot to say, and being a philosopher, I'm inclined to prattle on for approximately 3 hours on this subject, but I'll try to pull back from it. Feel free to just tell me to shut up at any time, Bernard. But so first of all, we want to distinguish between ethics on the one hand and ethical beliefs on the other, right? So to give you a kind of analogy, there's facts about, there's what water is composed of, H2O, and then there's your belief that water is composed of H2O. You might have had a different belief. Back in the day, they didn't have that belief when they didn't know about molecules, right? So, or maybe they made a mistake early on and they thought it was H3O, right? So there's what their beliefs are, then there's what the world is actually like. It's very clear that ethical beliefs vary across cultures. Of course, that's true. It's less clear that ethics varies across cultures. There may just very well be a set of ethical facts. So for instance, if you want some, the most plausible ones, genocide is immoral. You might think it's a perfectly fine thing to do. You might think like, oh, it's a lovely spring day, let's engage in some genocide. That would be a fine thing, but you'd be wrong, plausibly, right? If there are any ethical facts, that looks like a pretty good one. Okay, so that's one thing to say. So if you think of it that way, there's you can think of how should we approach this in two ways. One, how do we figure out what the right thing to do is? And the second is, what do we do given that people have varying moral beliefs? Two very different questions, right? And in fact, you might combine them in a way to say something like, what's the right thing to do given that people have different beliefs about the matter? Now, whatever decision you make, it's going to be an ethical one. Even if you say, you know what, let's just go with what they do in that culture, right? So let's say you're Google, right? And let's say, oh, I don't know, China asks you to create a censored search algorithm, right? A censored search engine. And you say, okay, Google says, okay, we'll do that. They haven't just, if you like, said, oh, we're just going with China's ethics. That's not our ethics, that's their ethics. Because what Google is doing is making the ethical judgment that it's permissible to defer to the Chinese government's judgment about what's okay. That itself, that it's permissible to defer to them, is itself an ethical judgment. So you don't get you never get to sort of not make an ethical judgment in these circumstances. You are making an ethical judgment. And then, of course, there are better and worse reasons for making a judgment. I don't know, was that too abstract? Does that make sense?
No, it makes complete sense. So anyone watching and listening live, are you worried about artificial intelligence and maybe that we're not getting it right ethically? So if you just pop in yes or no in the comments, that would be useful just to give us a feel of what's happening.
Yeah.
For you, Reid, do you think AI could actually be an existential threat to us humans?
Yeah. So okay. So I want to answer that question. I also want to answer Ruben Rennie Thomas's question. Could you please define what biased algorithms mean? So I've been talking about that stuff. I should take a step back and say a little bit more. So look, when we're talking about AI, and I'm sure your listeners know this since you do so much education, Bernard. But there's narrow AI and there's general AI. General AI is roughly the Terminator. It's basically a person built out of hardware. So there's a question about whether what's the likelihood of general AI, and if it does come about, does that mean the sort of destruction of humans? Are we just done here? That they're just going to take over? So that's one question. And then there's narrow AI, which is what we have right now, the vast majority of which is some variety of machine learning. And then there are certain kinds of ethical issues there that raise a bunch of other problems. So with regards to the general AI stuff, Terminator and all that, I am not worried. Number one, whenever you look at the arguments of people who say, look, we should really be scared here. So like Nick Bostrom, Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, I won't go through it now, but the arguments generally go like this. If A happens, then B will happen, then B might happen. And if B might happen, then C might happen. And if C might happen, then D might happen. And that would be the, apocalypse essentially. But they never assign probabilities to any of those things. So like, yeah, it could, like, if A happens, it's possible that B could happen. But if the probability is, 0.01, I'm not too worried, especially if it's 0.01 for each one of those steps, then we're looking at an overall very low probability. And I'd like to compare that probability to, say, the probability of climate change wiping us out. I suspect that the probability of climate change wiping us out is higher than the probability of a general AI being created and then scaling and then killing us all. So I'm not particularly worried. Now, when it comes to narrow AI, especially machine learning, there are really three main ethical concerns that are in some ways particular to that narrow AI. One of them is biased algorithms. So again, I assume that your audience knows quite a bit about this, but here's how machine learning works. You give it a bunch of examples, it learns, quote unquote, learns from those examples. And then once it sees, then when you give it a new example, it can tell you whether it's like those other ones. So you give it 1 million examples of dogs, and then you upload the 1,000,001st picture of a dog. If it's a dog, it says, oh yeah, it looked like those other ones. And if it's, unless it doesn't do very well, then it says it's not a dog, and you say, yes, it is, and then it learns that, and then so on and so forth. So it learns by example. And one of the problems is that there are ways of training, there's a way of giving examples that are in some way biased. So Lots of examples of this. Suppose I give you pictures of human faces. This is a famous, pretty well-known issue. I give you pictures of human faces because I want the ML, the machine learning, the AI, or whatever, to be able to recognize when there's a human in the photo or in the video feed, whatever you like. And I train it with all these different faces, but the vast majority of them are white men, and there are very few, say, Black women in the set of examples. I then haven't trained my facial recognition software to recognize Black women very well. And so we've seen that time and again, where just facial recognition software fails in a number of cases where it just can't recognize the faces of Black women because it hasn't been given enough training data. So that's the case of bias. That's a case and a source of bias when it says something like, oh yeah, that's a person, that's a white guy, whatever, and that's not a person. This gets really sort of impactful, especially when you're talking about things like looking at job resumes. Oh yeah, that's a good resume, that's a bad resume. Amazon was trying to create an ML that would recognize good resumes versus bad resumes. They trained it on the hiring data of the past 10 or so years. What the machine learning algorithm learned is that, oh, we don't hire women around here. And so then it started red lighting as opposed to green lighting all the women's resumes. So that's, in a nutshell, bias in AI. I feel like I'm talking very fast and I'm saying too much. Bernard, tell me to shut up.
That's all really useful, and I just had a little look through the stream, and I think the question, are people worried about AI? Lots of yeses. I don't think I've had any no that I could see, and people saying yes, we're excited, but we're also a little worried. Someone saying no. But most people are worried. I guess one of the biggest ethical concerns when it comes to AI is that it can increasingly do the things that previously only humans could do, which then challenges many jobs. And there is the one whether AI is dangerous, I discussed with Nick Bostrom, Oxford professor, recently. So you can see that on my YouTube channel or podcast if you want to discuss this. And I recently had a really good discussion with Professor Stuart Russell as well. We covered the importance of autonomous weapons and whether we need them or not. This is another really good episode that people can dive into. But when it comes to unemployment, and do you see this as a big threat?
Yeah, I think it's pretty worrying. I think it's quite worrying, in fact. So look, so first of all, there's questions about what the algorithms or what AI or ML, whatever you want to call it, will be able to do, say, right, what it can do now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And we're pretty bad at making these kinds of predictions. Incidentally, Descartes, the philosopher Rene Descartes, famous if you're a philosopher, famously thought that mathematical reasoning can only be done by a human, never a machine. Then, of course, now we have calculators. So he was wrong, right? So there's lots of stuff. When it comes to things like automation and job replacement, the line that you generally hear in response, if people are not worried, either they're very worried about it, or they say, oh, don't worry about it. We had the Industrial Revolution that put lots of people out of work, but it also created a whole bunch of new jobs. So we're good here. And I sort of find that response really frustrating. So for two reasons. Number one, that's a sample size of one. Right? You have to say the Industrial Revolution happened. It created more jobs than it destroyed. So we're good here. Sample size of one. You cannot make a justifiable inference from that sample size. It's just not enough. If you gave me, 1,000 examples of certain kinds of technological revolutions, and every time there was this massive technological revolution, it created more jobs than not, okay, you might be in better standing, but that's not where we are. So just appealing to the Industrial Revolution certainly isn't sufficient to justify the claim that will create more jobs than will destroy. The second thing to say is, let's grant for the sake of argument that it will create more jobs than it will destroy, but the jobs that it's going to create are going to require a set of skills and education that the people who are going to get put out of work simply don't have. And I don't know of any very strong, successful retraining program. So you're going to get, at least a generation of people who lose their jobs and can't get the new ones that were created because they don't have the skill set or the education for it. And then, of course, those people, they have less and less money, they have less opportunities. That means that they can give their children fewer opportunities. And, in certain countries like the US, poverty tends to get inherited. So, it's not a good scene. So even if the people who aren't worried are right that the digital revolution, that automation creates more jobs than it destroys, ultimately, there's still the massive problem of unemployment for at least the generation.
Yes, no, I see that too. And each time you think, okay, that it will definitely create new jobs, more jobs, but you also think the skill set of many of the jobs that will be replaced, of the people that hold those jobs, they are probably not the kind of skill sets that will easily transition into this new world. Yeah. We've talked quite a bit of doom and gloom. Carol Ann is making a good point here that big data and AI is also doing lots of really great things. It is improving healthcare. It is providing lots of things that would make the world a better place, will make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And so I completely agree. So really good point. I just wanted to pull this up.
Yeah, no. So let me say two things about that. The first thing to say is that I totally agree that there's tons of phenomenally ethically good uses to which AI can be put. AI in healthcare is a great example. So if you're using it to diagnose illnesses, and it's better at doctors at diagnosing them, that's fantastic. If you can use AI, as it seems like you can, people are doing it now with COVID, you can use it to figure out cures, vaccines, et cetera, that's phenomenal. There's not a question, I don't think, whether there are amazing uses to which the technology can be put when those uses are either for ethical ends or if you like ethically neutral ends, which is fine. Ethically neutral is, not bad, so that's fine. So I think I think people are rightfully excited about the technology. I mean, it can do some amazing things, and there's not a question that it's going to save tons of lives. So that's the first thing to say. Now, but the thing that I want to deny, though, or the thing where I want to pause is when she said something like, I don't think our leaders will put it to bad use. And I want to highlight that the issue is not whether you have ethically good or ethically bad ends or goals. The problem is that there's a ton of ethical pitfalls in pursuing those goals, whether they be ethically good or ethically neutral. So, for instance, you want to create. I'll give you an example in healthcare, where it at least raises some tricky ethical questions. You want to you create an AI that, as it were, divvies out livers. People have donated livers, people need livers. And so you say, okay, what should we do here? Well, we might say, what do we want to optimize? Well, what we want to make sure is that whenever we transplant a liver, we want to get the most years out of it as we can, right? So we're not going to give it to like a 99-year-old person because that person's probably going to die pretty soon, even if they get that liver, as opposed to say a 20-year-old, all else equal. And so you create an algorithm that roughly makes predictions about patients and their mortality rates, and then distribute livers in that way to maximize, years saved, not just lives saved, but years saved. Now, let's say you're in the US and you do that. Well, it turns out that in the US, for a variety of reasons that we don't need to go into, but there's lots of reasons. Some of them are themselves ethically problematic. Black people don't live as long as white people, and so what the AI will learn is Black people don't live as long as white people. So how do I maximize usage of this liver? I should give it more to white people than to Black people, all else equal. At least that becomes a weighted variable in the calculation. But then you might think, well, that's no good, right? That wasn't intentional, though. That was for an ethically noble end, trying to get the most use out of a donated liver. But there's an ethical pitfall along the way. And that's the issue with a lot of this stuff. It's not that the engineers or the people who oversee them are bad or that they have bad goals. They could have perfectly admirable goals, or at least at the very least not contemptible goals. But there's nonetheless ethical pitfalls you could fall into, like accidentally creating a discriminatory algorithm. And there's loads of ways of doing it. It's not just one way. There's lots of ways of getting bias into your algorithm. Remember, when you train those algorithms, you're training it on people. If the subjects are people, you're training it on people's data. which means that the fuel for artificial intelligence, or at least machine learning, is often people's data, which is an incentive to violate people's privacy. We oftentimes can't explain the outputs of our machine learning. The calculations that it's engaging in are just too complex. So, these are ethical problems that we run into independently of the goals that we have.
Yeah. So when it comes to ethics, then where does the responsibility lie? Is it the leadership team of the company? Is it the people that program the algorithms? Is it people that find the training data to make sure that this is all unbiased? Who is responsible here?
Yeah, look, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the organization, right? Because individual data collectors, individual engineers, individual product managers or owners can't be expected to drive, say, ethical risk mitigation into product development all by themselves, without any institutional support, including financial support, right? So let's say you're a particularly conscientious engineer, right? And you raise your hand to your team and you say, I'm a little bit worried about, this data set. It might be biased in some way, or I can see a number of ways that we might get biased or discriminatory outputs. We should slow down here and think about this and investigate. The rest of the team, they're like, no, we haven't been charged with doing that. Our product manager didn't tell us to do that. We have a certain deadline that we have to meet. We've got to get on to the next project. So we spent enough time on this one, and so on and so forth. So, and no one's career is going to get advanced by it, right? By slowing down and stopping it. Now, if that's the situation, you can put the burden on that individual engineer to change everyone's mind. Mm-hmm. There has to be institutional support, including financial incentives, or at least either financial incentives or the absence of financial disincentives.
So when companies want to become serious about ethics, and you obviously help them with this process, who's coming to you, and what sort of thing are they looking for? How can you help them?
Yeah. So this is, really what the Harvard Business Review article is really about. It's, usually I'll work with someone pretty senior level, like a chief analytics officer or a chief data officer or a chief data and analytics officer or a CIO, and so forth. And look, there are two kinds of things that I do. One is, if you like, ethical governance, right? So it's, how do we make sure in the development and deployment of our products that we are spotting ethical risks and we're mitigating them? Because as I said earlier, when I got into this business, this is not, to my mind anyway, this is not just about doing good. There's a lot of people there who characterize themselves as supporters of AI for good. And that's great. People who, for instance, want to create, AI that helps diagnosing diseases, right? That's great. I'm mostly AI for not bad. Right? I'm AI for just not ethically screwing up, which of course is a business risk, because it's reputational. It's at the very least reputational risk. And then there are a number of companies that are being investigated by regulators and or being sued for allegedly discriminatory algorithms, for being bad stewards of users' data, and so on. So what I'll do around the ethical governance side is I'll help first the company create a data ethics or data and AI ethics framework. So who are the relevant stakeholders? What are our standards? What are the role-specific responsibilities of data collectors, engineers, product managers, product owners, and so on? Mm. If our team, what are the standard ways that we're going to tackle biased algorithms and explainability and privacy violations? If those standard ways don't work and our team is trained properly to smell ethical smoke, what's the alarm they pull? What's the deliberative body that it goes to? Is it an ethics committee? Do we have to create an ethics committee? Do we already have, say, a data governance board that can deal with these issues? They're already an existing board. Can we sort of fold in our ethical risk mitigation strategies into our data governance strategies, sort of, dovetail that? So that's what I help them figure out. And then sometimes I'll work on particular products, right? Like, okay, so you're building this product. Let's think about all the ways you might ethically mess up. And we can think about ethical opportunities as well, and then help them, develop features to include or to not include. and then helping them articulate ethical best practices for the actual users of the product.
Very good. So how do you think companies are currently approaching ethics, and the approaches they're taking? Do you feel they're getting this right at the moment?
So generally, no. So what we've seen sort of I see two things, at least in sort of the private business world. So putting things like academia to the side, putting regulators to the side, and I'll just flag for the moment that all of this discussion is getting discussed by regulators. The EU recently released white papers on AI that was all about regulating AI, which is really around AI ethics. That's at the core of regulation that's coming down the line. What companies are doing now? So one thing that companies do is they come up with these high-level ethics principles. Google did this, Microsoft, but they're so high level that you can't operationalize them, right? So, for instance, companies like to say, we have a principle of, we will create fair AI. We're for fairness. Everyone is for fairness. Everyone can affirm. The KKK can say we are for fairness. They have a very different conception about what that actually looks like on the ground, but nonetheless, they can subscribe to the very general principle, we're for fairness, right? So one of the things that they're doing is that companies are saying, are coming out with these principles that are not operationalizable because they're too vague. And I've had clients come to me and say, here's a rough quote from a client, very, very large international company. They've been working on their AI ethics for the past year. And he said that we now have strong alignment on an advanced set of principles, but we don't know how to operationalize it. And it's because, the principles are too vague. And so we have to get away from these sort of high level ethics principles and get into something more concrete, like role specific responsibilities, like, a risk mitigation strategy.
Very good. Again, anyone listening to this live, use the comment function to maybe share with us some of the companies that you think are getting it right, and some of the companies that get it wrong. So if you just put right, a company, and wrong, a company, that would be very interesting to see, just to get a sense for what you think, how whether some of the ethical approaches are working or not. And Reid, you alluded to the fact that sometimes ethics is seen as a bit squishy, very subjective. Some of the ethical approaches are too high level. So how do you make this more actionable? What are some of the things that organizations can practically do?
So, one thing is to actually build out a proper framework, again, I think it's a risk mitigation framework around ethics. So, you might identify who the relevant stakeholders are, both internal and external. You might require certain, instead of just saying, here are the higher level principles that we abide by, here are the things that we will and will not do. And so I'm working with a client now where step one was an ethics statement that doesn't just say, we're for, trust. We believe in good judgment, as though anyone ever didn't believe in good judgment or anyone was, supporting bad judgment. They said, we will never, sell your data. We will never financially incentivize our engineers to do anything other than consider the welfare of the end user, so on. There's a whole list of things. So it wasn't just high level principles. It was definite things that they will and will not do. They can create, as I said earlier, they can create an ethics board, or they can fold in ethics to an existing board. They can, if there's already an existing board, they can use the processes by which concerns already get elevated to that board, and train people, educate people that they can raise other kinds of concerns, ethical risk concerns, to that board as well. Does that start to?
Yeah, very good. So what is stopping companies? What do you see as some of the biggest obstacles of actually operationalizing ethics?
Yeah. So, you said earlier, I didn't address this, that companies regard ethics as kind of squishy. I had a senior level executive at a company that we all know say exactly that. Yeah, we're trying to think, well-intentioned, takes risk mitigation really seriously. We're thinking through AI ethics and data ethics, but ethics is just sort of so squishy. So that's one of the obstacles, is that they don't know what to do with it, because it just feels like, oh, we got to talk about fairness or justice or discrimination. We have to talk about explainability and privacy, human welfare, what constitutes manipulation. And it's so high level and abstract that I think people just get frozen. Some people just get frozen in their tracks. That's it. For some organizations, they just lack the buy-in from senior leadership. I mean, look, these risks are relatively new. And just like it took people some time to be aware of cyber risks before they took cyber risk mitigation really seriously, it's going to take time for companies to take ethical risk mitigation seriously. But, as I said, there are already loads of companies that we all know that are being investigated by regulators, that are being sued. I mean, IBM is being sued. Optum is being investigated by regulators. Goldman Sachs is being investigated by regulators. As we see more and more of these examples, companies are going to wake up to the fact that let's not wait until it hits the fan, right? Because how many hundreds of millions of dollars does it cost to restore lost trust, right? How much money does it cost to, pay off fines of regulators? Or how much money does it cost for your employees to have to talk to those regulators all the time, instead of doing the normal work that they're supposed to do? So it costs a tremendous amount of money to realize one of these risks. What does it cost if they find out that you're negligent, right? That not only did you create, say, a biased algorithm, but you also did nothing to ever spot discriminatory algorithms. That's not, at this point, that's negligence or potentially recklessness. Those things are expensive. So as companies, as that kind of organizational awareness grows, and it is growing quite a bit, we're definitely going to see more and more people paying attention to it.
Very good. So if you are now have basically look into the future and make some predictions, what would you say about what are your future predictions around ethics? Will it become more important, less important? Will companies actually take it more seriously? Will regulators take it more seriously and step in and change it? How about politicians? So what if we look 5-10 years into the future, what do you see?
Well, the first thing to say is that, you're asking a guy who's sort of placed a bet on its being, on its increasing in public consciousness and in necessity, right? So there's an extent to which you might think that I'm biased, because, it's what I do. That said, I do it precisely because I made an independent prediction that it's a good space to be in. It's interesting, first of all, for me, but also I just think business-wise, it's a good space to be in. So look, I really started paying attention to companies spending money on this kind of thing, around the time of Cambridge Analytica. So it's been some time. I've only seen massive growth since then, massive amounts of attention drawn to it. I mean, the vast majority of AI conferences, they contain an AI ethics element. It's getting to the point where it would be really weird to not talk about AI ethics, say biased algorithms or privacy violations or explainability at an AI conference. That would be almost weird at this point, I think. As I said, the EU is working on their white papers for AI regulation. There's no question that regulation is coming on the pipeline, plus GDPR 2.0. In the States, the tech community is getting more and more fired up about it. I mean, as I said, there's a social dilemma. That's both a symptom and a cause, right? The social dilemma, as what seems to be a successful documentary, is both a symptom of the fact that people are paying more and more attention and they want to learn more, and it's also going to play a causal role in people paying more and more attention. So, it's actually going faster than I thought. So when I started the business, a few years ago, I thought, the data and AI ethics stuff, I'm not going to get a bunch of work from that. That's going to be a little while. And so I was going to focus more on what I call organizational ethics. How do you make an ethically sound organization? And my prediction turned out to be totally wrong. because that side of my business grew way faster than I anticipated, by years. There was certainly, less attention paid to it during the peak of COVID. But it's clear that from my perspective anyway, I only see interest in it growing. And especially by those chief data and analytics officers who really want to be at the cutting edge of their profession, they're paying a ton of attention.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was just looking through the stream here, and Erica is saying that universities have ethics boards. So before you sign off any research project, it has to go through a committee. They have to sign this off from an ethical perspective. And I think this is what companies should be doing too. I think that's the point Erica is making here.
And the other thing that I really like about Erica's point is that she mentions IRBs, which of course they're standard in healthcare. And one thing that I like to sort of tell as many people as I can is we don't have to reinvent the wheel here when it comes to ethical risk mitigation, which is what companies are doing. Healthcare has been doing this for ethical risk mitigation since at least the 70s, right? So there's things like informed consent. There are IRBs. Hospitals have ethics committees, right? So they have done not a perfect, but the best job of anyone at operationalizing ethical risk mitigation. And there's loads of things we can learn from healthcare, both in terms of the issues like how we should think about privacy, which of course looms large in the healthcare space with patient data, but also with process. What's the process by which we get informed consent? That's concrete. That's not squishy, whatever. That's, and it went from, we want to respect persons, but what does that amount to? That means respecting their autonomy. What does respecting their autonomy require? It requires that they consent, but not just consent any which way, not through manipulation or deception, but they consent after being informed, right? And then, okay, so we need to have it. They need to write it down. They need to read it. They need to sign it, right? Those are all really concrete steps. And I think that there's a ton to learn about ethical risk mitigation from the healthcare industry. And in fact, that's why one of my partners comes out of healthcare.
Very good. And I was just looking at Shirley's comment here, and she's saying, in my opinion, organizations that sweep these issues like data issues and ethics issues under the rug will eventually trip over the same rug. And I think this is absolutely true. So thank you so much for joining us today, Reid. That was
my pleasure.
Fascinating. Hopefully we can do this again and dive deeper into some of the more specific issues. Thank you very much for everyone joining us today. As always, let us know in the comments whether this was useful, what you thought of it, some of the key takeaways that you've taken away from today. And as always, if you want to re-listen to any of these conversations, you can see them on my YouTube channel, where you can also see hundreds of other conversations I've had, or you can listen to them on my podcast. Thank you very much, Reid, and thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for the questions.
Thank you.